The tank was American. Every man climbing onto it was German. In the spring of 1943, on a proving ground south of Berlin, engineers of the Third Reich painted white numbers on a captured American Sherman and set out to learn how their enemy built machines. They were looking for weaknesses. They found something else. They found a warning, stamped into 30 tons of steel, 2 years early, about exactly how the war on the ground was going to end. This is the story of what they read there and why nobody in Berlin wanted to believe it. The tank had a name painted on its hull, War Daddy II. It belonged to the 1st Armored Division, among the first Americans to fight German armor face to face. February 1943 was a hard month to be an American tanker in Tunisia. At Kasserine Pass, green American units ran head-on into Germans hardened by years of war, and the lesson they were handed was brutal and public, and paid for in burning vehicles scattered across the passes. The Americans would learn from it faster than anyone expected. But in those weeks, the Germans were winning, and they were collecting trophies. On February 22nd, near a crossroads town called Spatla, German troops of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion took War Daddy II, intact, a 30-ton prisoner of war. Most captured tanks got a quick fate, a fresh coat of paint, an oversized German cross on the hull so no friendly gunner would fire on it, and a new crew. This one drew something rarer, a ticket to Germany. It ended up at Kummersdorf, the army proving ground south of Berlin, the place where the Reich took apart everything its enemies built. The photographs from that testing still exist. You can look at them today. German crewmen in the black uniform of the Panzer troops sitting in the hatches of an American tank. Officers standing off in the grass, hands behind their backs, watching. And painted across the armor in careful white figures, the results of the first examination. The thickness of every plate and the angle it was sloped at. 65 millimeters at 42 degrees across the nose, 51 at 36 above it. They had measured everything a shell would ever need to know. That part was routine. Every army in that war measured captured equipment. You weigh it, you drive it, you shoot at it, and you write down what it takes to kill it. The German army was very good at this, and by 1943 it had years of practice. But the men at Kummersdorf did not just measure this tank. They ran it, day after day, across the churned ground of the proving range. They worked it the way you work a machine you are trying to break. And the machine declined to break. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what a tank meant to Germany. No country on earth took more pride in its engineering. This was the nation of Daimler and Benz, the nation that built the first automobile and never stopped believing it built the best ones. German weapons were made the way German cameras and German instruments were made, precisely, beautifully, fitted by craftsmen to tolerances that made other countries' machinists shake their heads. And by 1943, all of that faith was pouring into 2 new machines. The Tiger, a fortress of a tank, heavier than anything the Allies fielded, and the Panther, the tank that was supposed to win the war back. You can see the philosophy in something as small as the wheels. The Tiger's road wheels interleaved like the teeth of 2 combs, row behind row behind row. It was an elegant solution to spreading nearly 60 tons of weight, and engineers admired it. Then winter came on the Eastern Front, and mud froze solid in the spaces between those beautiful wheels, and welded the tank to the ground overnight. And when one inner wheel was damaged, the crews learned what elegance costs. Reaching it could mean pulling off half a dozen outer wheels first, in the open, in the cold, while somebody's artillery looked for you. On paper, though, The Panther was a masterpiece. Thick armor sloped like a ship's prow. A long, high-velocity gun that could reach out and kill a Sherman from distances the Sherman could not answer. Speed that no 45-ton machine had any right to have. German officers looked at it and saw the finest tank in the world. Plenty of historians, to this day, will tell you they were right. Now put a German engineer in front of the Sherman at Kummersdorf and let him look at it with those eyes. The silhouette stood tall and boxy, a target you could see a mile off. The gun was a short 75 with modest velocity. The examiners noted, correctly, that their own Panzer IV carried a better one. The armor was decent and nothing more. Nothing about the machine looked like a weapon anyone had labored over. It looked like something a tractor company would build, which, in a manner of speaking, it was. Detroit built it the way Detroit built trucks, and that is exactly the point this whole story turns on. Because the reports that came out of Kummersdorf did not read like an obituary for American engineering. They read like a warning. The verdict that has come down from that testing is blunt. Well-built, reliable, even comfortable, which sounds like a strange thing to say about a weapon, until you remember that 5 men had to live inside that machine for days at a time. A crew that can see, breathe, and reach what it needs to reach fights better than a crew that cannot. The Americans had thought about the men. It showed, and the enemy noticed. Soldiers in the field had noticed even earlier. A German document captured in Africa put it flatly. Tommy is using an American tank which has incredible armor and very good armament. After the war, one German general claimed under interrogation that the mighty Tiger had been hurried to Africa partly because of this tank. But it was under the hull that the machine got interesting. Everything on the Sherman came apart the way a civilian truck comes apart. The transmission and the final drives, the pieces of a tank that fail most often and matter most, sat in the nose as a single assembly, bolted on from the outside. A field crew with hand tools could unbolt the whole thing and swap it without ever dragging the tank into a workshop. The engine could be lifted out through the deck and a fresh one lowered in within hours. Hours, with a crane truck and ordinary wrenches, handled by ordinary men. The turret swung a full circle on power traverse in well under 20 seconds. A Panther crew, with their engine at low revs, could wait 3 times as long for theirs. The tracks ran on rubber blocks that lasted for thousands of miles. The gun even carried a stabilizer that let it fire on the move, a gadget so far ahead of its time that many American crews did not trust it yet. And the parts were the same. Tank after tank after tank, eventually tens of thousands of them, sharing gearboxes, sharing wheels, sharing bolts. A part stripped off a wreck in a ditch would fit a tank that rolled out of Detroit a year later. Nothing had been hand-fitted by a craftsman. And that was not a shortcut. That was the design. A hand-fitted part needs the hand that fitted it. An interchangeable part needs a box of spares and any pair of hands in the Army. The Sherman was not designed to be admired. It was designed to be fixed. To a certain kind of engineer, that is nothing. It is boring. It wins no prizes at any exhibition. Whether the men at Kummersdorf laughed at the boring machine, the record does not say. What the record does say is this: German units kept captured Shermans and fought in them wherever they caught one. The German army even gave the tank its own official designation, Panzerkampfwagen M4 748. After one battle in Alsace in the last winter of the war, the 10th SS Panzer Division drove a dozen captured Shermans back to its own lines. And German mechanics put captured Sherman hulls to work at one telling job above all: recovery vehicles. the machines they trusted to go out and drag other machines home. Remember that detail. It is about to matter a great deal. Because here is what was happening to Germany's own masterpiece while a captured Sherman was lapping the range at Kummersdorf. In the summer of 1943, the Panther went to war for the first time, at Kursk, in the largest tank battle ever fought. Hitler had postponed the whole offensive for weeks, waiting for this tank. Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer force, had begged him not to send it into battle unproven. He was overruled. 184 Panthers rolled toward the front on the 5th of July. 2 days later, 40 were still running. Most of the missing were not wrecks on a battlefield. They were sitting on roadsides. A report from those first days recorded that half the Panthers broke down before they even reached their assembly areas. Engines, transmissions, fuel pumps. 2 of them caught fire and were destroyed on the approach march, killed by their own machinery before any Soviet gunner ever saw them. On the 10th of July, Guderian inspected his new tanks in the field and wrote down what he found. 10 Panthers operational at the front, 25 destroyed outright, 100 sitting in the repair queue, and of those 100, 44 had been put there not by enemy fire, but by mechanical breakdown. Now, be fair to the Panther, because the men who crewed it deserve fairness. It was a brand new design and new tanks break. Many of the early faults did get worked out. By the following spring, Guderian could report that engine life had stretched from 700 kilometers to 1,000. Dug in on a ridgeline, a Panther was one of the deadliest things on any battlefield of the war, and Allied tankers feared it for good reason. Through the last half of 1943, though, the Panther fleet's fit-for-action rate crawled from 16% up to 37%. Even the average across every German tank type that autumn hovered near 44. This was an army learning to live on shrinking margins, and the disease never left the patient. A year after Kursk, in Normandy, Allied teams examined the Panthers the retreating Germans had left behind and found that half of the abandoned ones had been given up for a single reason: the final drive. The same kind of assembly an American crew could unbolt from the nose of a Sherman in a field sat buried deep inside the Panther's hull. When it stripped its gears, and it stripped them constantly, the tank needed a workshop, a heavy crane, and days of labor it was never going to get. And here is the number that tells you everything about the difference between the two armies. Germany built fewer than 300 recovery vehicles on the Panther chassis. Fewer than 300. For a fleet of thousands, in an army that was now nearly always retreating. Often the only thing on hand that could move a dead Panther was another Panther, and that gamble risked losing too. So when a Panther died on a road, there was very often nothing to bring it home. The crews poured fuel over the finest tank in the world and burned it themselves. The spare parts ran short as well, and the men at the top knew it. In German war production, a factory was judged by the new tanks it shipped, and every hour spent on spare parts was an hour taken from that count. So the Reich kept building wonders, and kept starving the wonders it had already built. Germany could build a masterpiece. What it could not build was the world around the masterpiece. The parts, the wreckers, the pipeline, the margin. None of this made the Sherman a safe place to sit. And if we are going to tell this story honestly, this is where we stop and say so. Because 70 years of myth have piled onto this tank from both directions. And the men who actually wrote it deserve better than the myths. An American tanker in 1944 knew exactly what he was riding. He knew a Panther's long gun could open his front plate from 2,000 yards. He knew his own 75 could not answer that armor head-on from any distance worth naming. The arithmetic of meeting a Panther face-to-face was brutal, and every crew in Normandy could recite it. You can still see the fear in the photographs, in the sandbags and spare track links, and even concrete that crews piled onto their hulls, hoping to buy an inch of protection the factory had not given them. And in that first summer in France, the Sherman earned a reputation for burning. That part was real. In those months, when a Sherman was penetrated, somewhere between 6 and 8 of every 10 caught fire. Crews saw it happen to the tank ahead of them in the column. Fear like that does not need exaggeration. It got exaggeration anyway. You have probably heard the nickname, Ronson, like the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. It appears in nearly every documentary ever made about this tank. Here's the thing. No one has ever found that nickname in a single wartime diary, after-action report, or interview. Not one. And the earliest advertisement anyone has found with that famous slogan is from 1950, 5 years after the war ended. The name is a legend that grew up afterward, on top of a real fear. The fire itself was misunderstood too. It was not the gasoline, whatever the stories said. Study after study, during the war and after it, found the same culprit: the ammunition. Racks of shells stored high in the hull sides, where a penetrating hit could light the propellant. So the Americans made one unglamorous change. They moved the ammunition low into the hull and jacketed the racks in water. Wet stowage, the engineers called it. After that one change, the burn rate collapsed, from as many as 8 tanks in 10 down to roughly 1 in 10. The fire mostly went out. The gun got its answers too. 76mm Shermans, British Fireflies carrying a 17-pounder that could kill almost anything the Germans made. The tank kept the same boring silhouette, and underneath it, the tank never stopped changing. That was the other thing interchangeable parts bought you. A machine you can fix is also a machine you can improve in the middle of a war without missing a step. But the strongest argument for the boring tank was one no engineer could measure on a proving ground, and it is the number this whole story has been walking toward. When a Sherman was knocked out in Northwest Europe, on average, 1 man died. 1 out of a crew of 5. Sit with that for a moment. The most mocked tank of the Second World War lost its crews at a rate far gentler than its reputation would ever admit. 4 men climbed out. They climbed out through hatches that had been designed and then redesigned for exactly that purpose. A second hatch cut into the turret roof when combat showed the loader needed his own way out. Springs balancing the steel so a wounded man could still lift it. And low in the floor behind the bow gunner, an escape hatch in the belly so that men could drop out of a burning tank and crawl away in the dark beneath the hull. Somebody in Detroit, somebody in the ordnance department, somebody who never fired a shot in anger, had sat at a drawing board and asked, "When this machine is hit, how do the men get out?" Entire armies fought that war without anyone asking the question that carefully. And while the men walked away, the machine itself refused to stay dead. Behind every American armored division rode a second, quieter army. Ordnance maintenance battalions, armored wreckers built on Sherman hulls, crawling onto the day's battlefield after dark to winch the day's losses out of the mud and drag them home. A young ordnance lieutenant in the 3rd Armored Division named Belton Cooper spent his whole war that way, and described it in a memoir half a century later. Go out at dusk to the wrecks. Decide which ones can live. Tow them back, patch the holes, swap the engine, clean out what the next crew should never have to see, and hand the tank on. Tanks knocked out one week were back in the line the next. A knocked-out Sherman was a patient. A broken-down Panther by 1944 was a corpse, and usually an organ donor. Run that loop once and it is a detail. Run it every day for 11 months, from the beaches of Normandy into the middle of Germany, and it is the whole war. The American tank fleet healed itself faster than the enemy could wound it. The German tank fleet bled to death, mostly from wounds no enemy had inflicted. So stand where the German engineers stood at Kummersdorf and look at the boring tank one more time. This time, you can see it. Every choice they had catalogued, the parts that interchanged, the assemblies that unbolted from the outside, the engine that came out in an afternoon, the hatches a wounded man could lift. Every one of those choices was the answer to a question German designers had never been asked to solve. The German question was, how do we build the best tank in the world? The American question was longer. It went something like this. How do we keep 5 men and 30 tons of machine in the fight at the end of a supply line 4,000 miles long for as long as this takes? And how do we get those 5 men out alive when the machine fails them? Germany answered its question. The Panther really may have been the best tank in the world. And it did not matter, because the best tank in the world spent half its life waiting for a final drive, and when it died on a muddy road, nothing came to tow it home. Yes, America also built nearly 50,000 Shermans, an output no German planner could even dream about. People will tell you that is the whole story, that Germany was simply buried in steel. But look closer at those numbers because they are made of the same decision. You can only build 50,000 of a tank that is simple to build. You can only keep a fleet that size alive with parts that interchange and with mechanics who learned their trade on Fords and farm tractors. The reliability and the abundance were the same philosophy, wearing 2 different uniforms. The Germans, in the end, voted with their hands. They kept every Sherman they could catch. They trusted captured Sherman hulls to rescue their own broken masterpieces. And in April 1945, in the ruins of a German town called Aschaffenburg, American infantry, fighting their way into the Reich, came under fire from an enemy tank. When the fight was over, the tank lying dead in the rubble was a Sherman, wearing a German cross. In the last month of the war, Germany was defending German soil with the enemy's tractor. There is no cleaner picture of how this argument ended. One more thing. Because this channel does not exist to argue about machines, it exists for the men. The Sherman crews knew the arithmetic. They had seen what a long German gun did to the lead tank in a column, and they mounted up the next morning anyway, into a machine the whole post-war world would spend 50 years calling a death trap. Historians have been dismantling that name for decades now, and the numbers, as you have heard, tell a different story. But the men could not know the numbers. They only knew the fear, and they climbed in anyway. And behind them stood men nobody ever made a movie about. The wrecker crews working a battlefield at midnight under hooded lights. The mechanics doing an engine swap in the freezing rain of a Belgian winter so the tank could attack at dawn. The German engineers at Kummersdorf had been staring at those men's shadows on the steel all along. Every boring, humble, replaceable part of that tank was the work of 10,000 hands the crews would never meet. All of it aimed at one unglamorous goal: keep the machine running, keep the men inside it alive. The proving ground at Kummersdorf fell silent in 1945. The record of what its engineers found there survives mostly in photographs, and history has graded it correct on nearly every line. The Sherman was not the best tank of the Second World War. It was only the tank that was still running. On the day the best tanks in the world were ashes on the side of a road. Wars, it turns out, are won by the weapon you can keep alive, and by the people stubborn enough to keep it alive. If there was a man in your family who served in armor, a tank commander, a gunner, a driver, a loader, or one of the motor pool men who kept those machines alive and was never once called a hero for it, leave his name in the comments below. His name and his unit if you know it. The tank he served in spent 70 years being called a failure by people who never had to ride one. He knew better. Let him be right one more time. I read every single name.